My name is John Dodson. I'm an urban farmer in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm for the soil because without healthy soil, there's no healthy food. With no healthy food, there's no healthy life.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee. Joining me are my co-host, Dr. Eric Bendfeldt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Dr. Bendfeldt, would you introduce our special guest today?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. We're very pleased to have Dr. Elizabeth Heilman with us. Dr. Heilman's a professor of education at Wichita State University. She's also a co-owner and founder of Regenerative Wisdom with her husband, Dale. And she's been a frequent contributor to Green Cover Seed soil health guides through the years, and very pleased to have Dr. Heilman join us. If Dr. Heilman, if you could share a little bit about your background and your experience with agriculture and education.
Sure. Well, my very first department chair was Jerry Peters at Purdue, and he was somebody heavily involved in agricultural education and also the hog crisis. So that's somewhat of an unusual background, perhaps, for somebody in education. But I've always had that passion to teach not just science and ecology education, but also to really look at the land. So when we're understanding land and we're trying to teach healthy ecosystems, sometimes that's taught with the sense of a pristine ecosystem, an ideal ecosystem. But in the United States, 52% of land is in agriculture, and agriculture can happen in ways that are completely ecologically sound. And so that is a big part of my motivation. I worked years ago in 2005 with some doctoral students who were working on soil health education. And I thought, this was 2005, I thought, well, maybe by 2010, the entire country will be using integrated pest management, soil health principles. You know, we will have sequestered carbon to make healthy environments, and it will all be finished, because it seemed to me that even that long ago, 19 years ago, a lot of the soil health principles were well understood. So that led to my interest then in understanding farmers and ranchers in terms of why people will or will not try different techniques. Because we all know that right now in the United States, only 4/5 of acres are in no-till, for example, even though there can be a lot of benefits ecologically and fiscally to farmers to trying that. So that led to my looking at reasons why people adopt certain practices in soil health, reasons why they might resist them, and to try to work towards getting entire communities regionally to be involved in regeneration. So that's quite a long introduction, but that's how I came to do some of what I do.
That is interesting, Dr. Heilman, that you use the word resistance. And it brings to mind an occasion where I was talking with a farmer one time, and he jokingly said that the only change that farmers like to see, it comes from a vending machine. Anyway, but resistance. Do you see some resistance when it comes to changing our management techniques when it comes to soil health?
Well, it does. And what I found through my research is that farmers are actually in a profession that has what we would call the highest safety trauma of all professions. So what does that mean? So what we need to feel the most safe is conditions that are predictable, right? And so if you're an accountant or you're a professor perhaps, or a school teacher, you have a pretty good idea of what your year is going to be like, what your income is going to be like. But farming is very much not that way, because there's so much that's out of our control. So input costs are out of our control. When we plant, we're not sure what commodity prices are going to be. Those can go up and down, and they often don't even correlate to food prices. It's hard to predict what you're going to sell your crop for. And certainly the weather is out of our control. And so that just makes for more stress inherently built into that. Now, regenerative farming can make all of those more stable, including the weather, which I can talk about. But just in terms of this idea of being change resistant, anybody that has what we would call safety trauma, that tends to make you either risk averse or it can make you highly risk taking. And both of those are bad for trying new techniques, right? So one of them is that up and down that's inherent in farming. That's just built into nature and commodity prices. But we've also had a lot of policy that can throw people for a loop through the years. So during the 70s and 80s, there was massive consolidation of farms and loss, right? And so some of the people that survived some of those policy changes are people that had to really dig in, work hard, deal with a lot of sadness from farms around them closing down. That's a lot of trauma. That's a lot of stress. And then it affects how people go forward in decision making. Farmers are well represented in gambling. Casinos will have a lot of farmers, a lot of sports betting. Kansas is number 3 in the country for sports betting with a very small population. Why? Well, 87.5% of Kansas land is farms, right? And so that's safety trauma there. Another part of safety trauma is that farming actually has the highest injury rate of any profession. And so that's the sort of thing that you can get anxiety out of your body after you've been injured. There's ways to deal with it, but you have to be aware of it. You have to know how to process through it. And the same is true about risk aversion. So gambling is something that can be up and down, and farming becomes literally like that. So if a farmer has a good crop, we tend to feel like, wow, I'm a great farmer now. Look at my crop. We take credit when the weather's good, when the crop is good, when the commodity prices are high. We feel successful, even though some of that is out of our control. The flip side is that when there's a drought, when commodity prices are bad, when input prices go up, when there's policies that are difficult to negotiate and might cause adverse circumstances, right? Or we can't find a meat processing plant that'll take our cattle at a certain time, then we absorb that stress personally. So that makes farming a very high stress occupation for safety and security. And that alone is daunting, right? So that means that when people have those feelings, they will go towards a more secure types of choices. So sometimes farmers would rather be good at a bad practice than bad at a good practice, right? And
Very
so that,
interesting.
yes. And then another factor then is esteem. So we're more confident taking risks when we feel like we have good self-esteem, right? The world thinks well of us. Doctors, lawyers, right? Maybe those accountants that I spoke of are all generally thought of as good professions. Lots of farmers don't want their kids to be farmers. And there's a lot of mockery in popular culture towards farmers. Farmers are hicks. Michael Bloomberg said anybody can be a farmer. You just put the seed into the ground and, that's mocking. I wrote an article years ago called Hoosiers, Hicks, and Homeboys, the uncertain place of marginalized ethnic whites in multicultural ed, because in Appalachia, those kids can be looked down on in schools and in communities, the farm kids or Appalachian kids. It's sort of a group that's still okay to make fun of. So then if you're a farmer, you're not thought well of in society particularly. That's an esteem burden that you carry. And then that makes you less likely to take risks because everybody needs to feel like they're good at something.
And Dr. Heilman, the concept of safety trauma is so interesting, especially as you explained that relationship between both being risk averse, but also excessive risk taking. And so I guess, what would you recommend as for practitioners, whether it's cooperative extension, soil and water districts, in working with producers in that context, as we're working to increase soil health and soil health building systems amid that?
Right. Well, the first thing is that we should all be aware of it. So it's helpful for all of us, extension agents, farmers themselves, to know, look, everybody, this is a really emotionally difficult profession, right? That's an interesting way to think about it, isn't it? And then to give people permission to be anxious when they're trying something new. So we worked in New Mexico with a rancher We had a field day there, and he mentioned that the very first time he drilled a cover crop into a pasture, he was shaking, right? And so when we make that normal, when shaking when you're drilling a cover crop is something that is very common, it helps people not worry, to have a lot of anxiety around it. So we say, look, everybody feels anxious about this. This is typical. Or if you are doing tillage and you're switching to no-till, don't feel ashamed. Everybody tilled. That was just what we were all taught to do. It doesn't mean you were a bad farmer before. It's okay to try it. And there's certain techniques that are in psychology or self-care that are very helpful in improving risk-taking. So one of them is called Eat That Frog. And it just means doing the thing that you most dread to do first. First in the day, first in the week, first in the season. And teaching producers about that, to say, look, you're in a profession that has a lot of emotional stress. One of the things that you might do is put off making certain decisions or doing the hardest thing. Try this out, right? Try to do the worst thing first in the day, and it helps people. So when you accumulate little strategies that reduce stress, that improve that safety stress, then producers are more likely to try new things. Another one is to keep a done list, not just a to-do list. When you work on a farm, there's always endless work to be done, right? And so people have these to-do lists, but what that does is it has your little lizard brain worried that you're in this endless sea of activity. Because what humans are is, first of all, underneath we have a lizard or reptile brain, and that handles anxiety. And then on top of that, we have a mammal brain with a frontal cortex on top. So the way to think of it is you have to calm your lizard down, and you don't want the lizard to run the farm. So
That could be a bumper sticker. I want to
yes,
calm my lizard down.
you have to calm the lizard down and don't let the lizard run the farm, right? So you can make your lizard feel better by every day doing a done list of what you got done, and you'll see that you got a lot finished. And then it makes the brain feel like there's less of an emergency, that I'm not on this endless scary treadmill. It's a tiny technique, but it makes a difference. And every time you write down something that you accomplished, you get a dopamine hit. Dopamine calms down the nervous system. So another one related to that is a gratitude list that people write down, maybe just 4 or 5 things every day. It takes 6 to 7 weeks to make a neurological pathway related to gratitude. You have to do it 4 or 5 times a week for 6 or 7 weeks. But what it does is it then makes your brain oriented towards half full, that things are better, more optimistic than they are negative. So these sound trivial, but they're not the sort of things that people necessarily think about as being important. We visit a lot of farms. Some of them have vision statements. They have the soil health principles posted. That also really helps producers. 75% of our sensory apparatus is visual. So that means if you make a vision board full of great images of what your farm can be like, you take pictures of progress on your farm, you post the soil health principles, your farm has a mission statement. Every time you look at it, you get a dopamine hit. You feel serotonin, that you're part of a group that's doing something positive. And those things can add up. So the vision statement, a vision board, soil health principles where you can see them, doing the done list, doing the gratitude list, all of those make farmers feel safer and more optimistic. We've heard that farmer suicide is high, right? That's because it's very stressful. So these sound trivial, and yet they really work. And when we speak and we do field days and we talk about emotional health, the people that come up afterwards are usually older men and hard-bitten cowboys, right? That talk about these kinds of issues because people resonate with it. The final one that is helpful for everybody, and certainly for farmers and ranchers, is noticing when you have an inner critical voice. So I talked about how farmers don't have a lot of prestige in our culture, right? So they don't necessarily get the goodies emotionally of being a generally respected profession. Farmers can be blamed for ecological issues, right? And feel like they're not as appreciated as they could be. Add to that the fact that many people in American culture have a negative inner critic voice speaking to them. Now, if you grew up on a farm family, you're most likely to have what we call traditional authoritative parenting, where you're valued for what you do for work, not necessarily for just who you are when you wake up every day. So farmers have that extra risk too. So what can you do about that? What you can do about that is notice when you have that inner critic voice and actively give yourself praise as you're going through the day. So those seem small, but they add up and they can make a big difference in making farmers and ranchers more comfortable with trying innovative practices.
We're talking today with Dr. Elizabeth Heilman, and this is For the Soil, a conversation. Dr. Bendfeldt, you can have the last question. Just about a minute or so left.
Well, I've actually, Dr. Heilman, I've actually had colleagues that are sort of averse to using the word ecology or agroecology, and yet you're talking about a systems and creating a farming ecology, if you'd like to speak more to that.
Yes, well, it's something that I think a lot of farmers can understand, right? Because when you start to make soil health changes, you get to see your farm becoming healthier and healthier, and that is an enormous motivator. So farmers are actually very aware of ecology, and that is an important motivator for many people to make changes on their farm. You can make money by having a very chemical-oriented or traditional, farming system, but when you transition and you get to see life coming back and the smells on a farm that have cover crops and more diversity improving, that is motivational. And the best ecologists that I know, the best environmentalists by far, are farmers and ranchers. They're absolutely incredible. So this idea that environmentalists or ecologists are people that are separate from farms, I think is not the case. So I know farmers that have 15,000 acres in regenerative organic practice. So to be able to pull that off and make a lot of money, they're incredible observers of nature. They're acutely aware of making nature healthier and healthier. And everybody wants more land when you're in farming. And so we try to teach folks to get more land by going down into the soil instead of going out in acres. So if you can take your farm and go from 1.5% to 3%, 5% soil organic matter, then you have a bigger farm, right? And that's a really important hook for folks.
Great information. And I hate to jump in here, but we're right up against the clock here for the podcast. Our guest today has been Dr. Elizabeth Heilman. She is a professor in the School of Education at Wichita State University. For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode of the podcast, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.